The drone footage had been circling for 11 minutes before anyone on the ground saw the horse. He appeared at the edge of a dry creek bed, moving through the amber light of late afternoon like something the land itself had exhaled. Enormous, gold-coated, with hooves the size of dinner plates and a mane that caught the Wyoming wind like a loose flag. 200 ranchers had spent the better part of a decade trying to rope, tranquilize, corner, or simply touch this animal. 200 men with helicopters, ATVs, electric fencing systems, and enough combined capital to buy a small county. Not one of them had come within 50 feet of him. But on a Tuesday morning in late October, with frost still sitting on the grass and a single rusted weather vane turning slowly above an old barn, the horse walked onto the property of a 62-year-old widow with 12 acres, a broken water heater, and a past due tax notice pinned to her refrigerator door, and he lay down. Before we go any further, there's something worth pausing on here. This horse had outrun ranchers, drones, professional wranglers, and a coordinated network of electric fences across 3 counties. He had been called wild, dangerous, uncontrollable, and worth a fortune. And out of every acre of land in Wyoming, he chose 12 acres, belonging to one woman. Think about that for a second. What is it about a place, or a person, that makes something completely untamable decide to stop running? If that question already has you curious, leave a comment below with the city you're watching from. It genuinely means a lot to see where these stories land. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time, because this one doesn't go where you think it's going. Let's begin. The Bighorn Basin region of northwestern Wyoming is not a place that forgives weakness. The land out there operates on its own terms, wide open in ways that seem almost confrontational, cut through by creek beds that run deep in spring and turn to cracked white clay by August. The sky sits low in winter, bruised purple along the ridgeline by 4 in the afternoon. The wind doesn't gust so much as lean, a constant, deliberate pressure that peels paint off barns and pushes old fence posts slowly out of alignment year after year. It was the kind of country that Arthur Briggs had loved with an intensity that bordered on the irrational. He had ranched there for 31 years, building up a modest operation, around 400 acres at its peak, through careful husbandry, fair dealing with neighbors, and the kind of patient, methodical work that doesn't make a man rich but builds something that lasts. He had a small herd of Angus cattle, a few horses he kept for work rather than show, and a kitchen garden that his wife Leona tended with the same quiet stubbornness she brought to everything else. Arthur died on a February morning 6 years ago. Heart, the doctor said. Fast. The kind of end that gives nobody time to prepare, which is the crueler kind. What came after was slower and in some ways harder. The debts Arthur had carried, carefully, responsibly, but still, didn't vanish with him. There were 2 outstanding loans on equipment, property taxes that had been deferred during a bad drought year, and a mortgage refinancing that had seemed manageable when commodity prices were higher. Leona spent the first year trying to hold the operation together by herself. The second year, she began to sell. The old north pasture first, then the east acreage along the creek, then the equipment lot. By the time the accounting was finished, what remained was a strip of land along the western edge of the original property, 12.5 acres, a small house, an aging barn, and 1 outbuilding used for hay storage. The neighbors who had bought the surrounding parcels had not been unkind, exactly, but they had not been sentimental either. Land in that valley had value, and value moved quickly. Leona stayed. This was not, by any measure, a heroic decision. It was a practical one, mixed with something she couldn't quite name and didn't try to, a resistance to the idea of leaving the last physical place where Arthur had walked, eaten, slept, and looked at the sky. The house still had his handwriting on a notepad stuck to the refrigerator, a grocery list from a Tuesday years ago. Milk, 2 cans of pinto beans. WD-40. She hadn't moved it. She ran a small hay operation on the remaining land, just enough to keep a few acres productive, selling through the Powder River Agricultural Cooperative that served the region. It covered her costs in good years. In bad years, it didn't. The past 2 years had been bad. Each night, before going inside, Leona carried a wooden bucket to the eastern fence line, the border where her land met the expanded holdings of the Creston Ranch, the largest operation in the county. The bucket held water, sometimes mixed with a pinch of salt and dried chamomile that grew wild along the south wall of the barn. Arthur had started the habit years before, not as a strategy, just as a thing he did, leave something at the edge for whatever was passing through. Deer, coyotes, the occasional pronghorn coming down from higher ground in dry spells. Leona kept doing it because stopping felt like another small erasure. She was not expecting anything in particular. She was certainly not expecting him. The first reports of the horse that would come to be called Sovereign appeared approximately 9 years before the October morning he walked onto Leona's land. He had been sighted near the Owl Creek Mountains initially. A young stallion, clearly of mixed breeding, but with a size and conformation that stopped people mid-sentence. Deep gold coat, 17 hands at minimum. A chest like a draft horse with the legs of something built for speed. Whoever had bred him, and nobody ever established this conclusively, had produced something outside the expected catalog. He moved through the region like a season, showing up near one property, gone before anyone could react, grazing along fence lines without crossing them, drinking from stock tanks left unattended. He was not aggressive, he was not destructive, but he was completely, categorically unwilling to be contained. The first organized attempt to capture him happened in his second year of sightings, organized by a coalition of ranchers who recognized his breeding value. They used traditional wrangling methods, a slow approach, familiar techniques. The horse watched the riders close to within 200 yards, then turned and covered a quarter mile in under 30 seconds. The lead wrangler later described it as watching something that had simply decided, with complete calm, that the conversation was over. The second attempt, the following spring, used a helicopter. The horse ran for 11 miles before the fuel situation forced the helicopter to turn back. By the fourth year, Sovereign, a name the county had settled on informally, the way rural communities name things that resist official categorization, had become something between a local legend and a standing embarrassment. He had been the subject of 3 formal capture operations, one attempt involving tranquilizer equipment that went badly when the dart missed and hit a fence post, and an elaborate fencing scheme that cost one consortium of ranchers approximately $40,000 and resulted in the horse standing on the correct side of the closed gate, as if he had always intended to be there. What nobody in those years fully accounted for was this. Sovereign wasn't simply fast or instinctively fearful. He appeared to read intentions. Approach him with a rope coiled at your side. He was gone before you raised it. Approach him with open hands. No halter, no agenda. He might hold position for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, watching. The men who tried this almost universally reported the same unnerving sensation, that the horse was assessing them rather than the other way around, and finding them wanting. By year 6, the organized pursuit had modernized. Roscoe Callahan, who ran the Creston Ranch and served as president of the Basin Ranchers Association, had poured significant personal resources into the effort. Roscoe was 67 years old and had spent his adult life building something most people in the region genuinely respected, a well-run cattle and breeding operation, methodically expanded over 4 decades through shrewdness, networking, and a capacity for long-term thinking that most of his peers lacked. But Sovereign had become a different kind of problem for him. Not purely financial, though the horse's stud value was genuine and substantial. It was the principle. A wild stallion moving freely through a landscape that Roscoe and his peers largely controlled felt, to Roscoe, like a loose thread. Something unresolved, something that made the neat order of things look slightly provisional. He authorized the use of aerial drones equipped with thermal imaging. He coordinated rolling fence installations that attempted to narrow the horse's range over weeks. He hired a professional wrangler from New Mexico who had a national reputation for capturing difficult animals. A man who arrived, watched Sovereign move for 2 days, and then asked for his fee back. The horse shed weight over the following year. His hooves showed signs of stress from the constant movement across rocky terrain. The cracking and were patterns visible to anyone who got close enough, which almost nobody did. He stopped appearing near water sources during daylight hours. He became more careful, more precise about exposure. He was being ground down, not captured, not defeated, but slowly, measurably worn. And then October came. On the morning of October 14th, Leona woke before 5, as she always did in that season, with the cold already pressing through the single-pane window above the bed. She moved through the house in the dark without turning on lights, a habit built over decades of early mornings in a house she knew by feel. Coffee first, then the notebook on the kitchen table where she tracked hay inventory, equipment condition, and expenses in a handwriting that had gotten smaller and more precise over the years, as if she were rationing paper. The tax notice was still on the refrigerator. She glanced at it the way you look at a sore tooth with your tongue, not directly, but aware of it constantly. The amount was not enormous in the abstract. In the context of her current income, it was substantial. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside just before 6. The frost was heavy that morning, the kind that makes every stem and grass blade look outlined in white, the whole landscape briefly precise and formal. She crossed to the barn, checked on the 2 older horses she still kept, a mare named Dulce and a gelding called Pepper, both past their working years, and then she gathered the bucket from its hook on the east barn wall. She mixed the water by feel. A measure of salt from the coffee can Arthur had kept specifically for this purpose, still on the same shelf. A handful of dried chamomile from the bunch hanging near the door. She walked the fence line in the near dark, her breath visible, the bucket heavy in her right hand. She set it down at the usual spot, a gap in the posts where the wire ran slightly lower, where deer had been crossing for years, and straightened up. There was a sound, not loud, not alarming, more like the sound of something very large settling its weight onto the ground. A long, slow exhalation of breath through a wide chest, the quiet collapse of a heavy body finding rest. Leona stood still. The light was just coming up over the eastern ridge, gray and directionless. She could see perhaps 40 feet. He was 20 feet away. The horse was already on his side when she first properly saw him, lying in the frozen grass on her side of the fence, his flank rising and falling with the slow rhythm of something completely at ease. His coat caught the dawn light and held it in a way that seemed almost deliberate, the gold of him oddly warm against the white frost. Leona did not move for a long time. She had heard about Sovereign. Everyone in the valley had. She had watched, with detached interest, the years of news about failed captures, the growing reputation, the increasing frustration among the ranching community. She had found the whole situation mildly absurd and privately gratifying in a way she hadn't examined too closely. But this was not abstract. This was a 17-hand horse lying down 20 feet from her fence line, breathing slowly, with his eyes half closed. She set the bucket down the rest of the way, very carefully, and backed up 2 steps. His ear moved, a single flick in her direction. Acknowledgement, maybe, or just the reflex of an animal that never fully stops processing the world around it. Then it stilled again. She stood there until the light was fully up. 40 minutes, maybe more. The cold was serious by then, settled into her joints. She didn't go inside. By the time she finally turned back toward the house, the frost had begun to lift from the grass, and the bucket was empty. She told nobody. Not that day. Not the next day, when the horse appeared again before dawn and was gone by mid-morning. Not the day after that, when she found the grass near the fence pressed flat in the shape of something enormous, the imprint of a body at rest. She kept putting out the bucket. It was Roscoe's drone operator who spotted it first. The thermal imaging had been running regular sweeps of the Creston property and the surrounding areas since September, tracking the horse's movement patterns. On the morning of October 19th, the operator, a young man named Davis who ran the drone program from a console in Roscoe's office building, noticed a heat signature that didn't match the usual patterns. It was on the Briggs property. He flagged it to Roscoe and said nothing further because that was his job. Roscoe looked at the screen for 30 seconds, then walked to the window that faced west. He was in the office by 7 the following morning with his ranch manager and his lawyer. The situation, as Roscoe saw it, was straightforward. Sovereign was resting on a 12-acre parcel that Leona Briggs could barely afford to maintain. The horse was technically a feral animal. No registered owner, no brand, no documented provenance. Under Wyoming law, the situation regarding ownership of feral horses on private property involved nuances that Roscoe's lawyer had already begun researching by the time the morning meeting started. Roscoe drove to Leona's property that afternoon himself. She was splitting wood behind the barn when she heard the truck. She didn't stop what she was doing until he was close enough that stopping became necessary. He was a tall man, still physically imposing at 67, with a face that had been shaped by decades of wind and decision-making into something that looked less like a face and more like a position. He held his hat in both hands, which was a deliberate gesture. She recognized it. He told her he knew the horse had been on her land. He told her he understood that she might not have known what she had. He told her about the stud value, about the breeding program, about what the animal could mean for the genetic lineage of working quarter horses in the region. Then he told her about the offer: full retirement of her outstanding property taxes, purchase price at 300% of assessed value for the parcel. All she needed to do was sign a management access agreement, a standard document. His lawyer had already drafted it, allowing his crew to enter the property at scheduled times to secure the animal. She listened to all of it without asking a question. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked him one thing: whether the horse would be left to live as a free animal or used for breeding. Roscoe told her that wasn't the relevant question. The relevant question was whether she wanted to lose the property to the tax authority in February. She didn't answer that. She told him she'd think about it and went back inside. Roscoe walked back to his truck slowly. He was a man who had spent decades reading negotiations, and something in that conversation had given him a feeling he didn't entirely trust. The specific flatness of someone who has already decided and is being courteous about the timing of the announcement. He drove back to the Creston property and told his ranch manager to double the drone sweeps. What he didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that 3 nights earlier, Leona had brought Dulce and Pepper out of the barn at dusk and stood with them at the east fence while Sovereign watched from 20 feet away. The old mare had walked to the fence line and extended her nose. Sovereign had held position for a full minute before taking 2 steps forward and touching his muzzle to hers. Leona had watched this and felt something she couldn't name shift inside her chest. She went inside and took the tax notice off the refrigerator. She held it for a while. Then she put it back. She called the county extension office the next morning and asked, very specifically, about Wyoming statutes regarding feral or estray horses that establish residency on private land. The legal framework, as the county extension agent explained, was both clear and complicated. Under Wyoming statute, an animal of unknown ownership that remains on private property for a documented period and is provided with care and sustenance could be claimed by the property owner through a formal estray process, a filing with the state brand board, a published notice, and a waiting period. The property owner was not obligated to surrender the animal simply because a third party wanted it, so long as no prior legal claim existed. Sovereign had no brand, no documented owner, no registration anywhere in the state. Leona filed the paperwork on October 23rd. The document was public record. Within 48 hours, Roscoe's lawyer had a copy. What followed was not dramatic in the way most confrontations are dramatic. There were no raised voices, no visible confrontation at the fence line. What happened instead was a series of quiet removals, the kind of pressure that operates through absence rather than presence. The Powder River Agricultural Cooperative sent Leona a letter explaining that her hay supply contract for the coming season was being discontinued due to a reorganization of their supplier network. The letter was polite. The timing was not coincidental. 3 neighbors who had previously, informally, allowed Leona to use their equipment in exchange for help during calving season stopped returning her calls. The diesel supplier she had used for 15 years raised her per gallon rate by 30% without explanation. None of this was illegal. None of it was even, in the specific framing each party would use, personal. It was the ambient pressure of a community in which one man was the economic connective tissue, the largest employer, the cooperative board chair, the person whose goodwill determined whether a dozen smaller operations had access to shared resources. Leona spent a week watching it happen. She kept her face arranged into something neutral when she encountered neighbors at the feed store or the gas station. She bought what she needed with the money she had left and did not ask for credit. On the 5th night after filing, she was at the east fence with the bucket when Sovereign came closer than he had before. He approached from the south side of the fence gap, moving slowly, his head low, not the lowered head posture of a horse under threat, but something more deliberate, more considered. He stopped 4 feet from her. She could hear his breathing clearly. She could see, in the fading light, the condition of his front hooves, cracked along the walls, the left forefoot showing the early signs of a stress injury that would worsen through winter without attention. She stood still. She did not reach for him. He reached for her. A slow extension of his nose toward her shoulder, a motion so unhurried it seemed almost formal. She felt his breath against her jacket. She stayed absolutely motionless. After a moment, he pulled back, turned, and walked 15 feet into the property, laid down in the grass, and closed his eyes. She stood at the fence for another 20 minutes in the dark before going inside. The following morning, she called a large animal veterinarian in Cody named Dr. Vargas and asked about treatment options for hoof stress injuries in feral horses that had begun to show willingness to approach humans. Then she called the county brand board and asked how to expedite the estray process given documented evidence of the horse's deteriorating physical condition. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers again. The discontinued cooperative contract meant a loss of roughly $11,000 in projected winter income. The tax obligation was $8,000, due in February. Her reserves, after the last equipment repair, were just under $4,000. She wrote the numbers down very carefully and looked at them for a long time. Then she put the notebook away and went to start the evening feeding. The hearing was set for the second Thursday of November. Roscoe had filed a formal objection to the estray claim through his lawyer, citing both a private ownership argument, based on a creative interpretation of range rights that his attorney acknowledged was thin, and a public safety concern. The safety filing was the more substantive angle. It alleged that Sovereign had demonstrated aggressive behavior toward ranch workers and livestock in the area, constituting a biological and physical risk under the county's agricultural protection ordinance. If the allegation held, the county could order removal of the animal regardless of Leona's estray claim. The hearing would be presided over by Judge Clara Oates, who had served the county court for 11 years and was known in the region for two things: a complete lack of patience for procedural theater and an almost scientific commitment to the evidence actually in front of her. The morning of the hearing, Roscoe arrived at the courthouse with his lawyer, his ranch manager, and a folder containing signed statements from 7 ranchers and 3 ranch workers alleging aggressive behavior incidents involving Sovereign. Charges that all 7 men delivered with the specific phrasing of people who had been coached on what to say and what to avoid. Leona arrived alone. She carried a manila folder with her own documentation, the estray filing, the veterinary correspondence, a personal log of dates and observations going back to the first morning she had found him on her land. She had also brought, folded in her coat pocket, a single photograph taken by a trail camera she had positioned near the fence 3 weeks earlier. The image showed Sovereign lying down in the frost, completely at rest, with the empty water bucket visible 6 feet from his head. The hearing began at 9. Roscoe's lawyer presented the safety objections first, thorough, professionally organized, leaning hard on the signed statements. He used the phrase uncontrollable feral animal 6 times in 20 minutes, which was 3 times more than necessary, and which Judge Oates noted visibly in her expression each time. Leona's presentation was brief. She laid out the timeline. She submitted the veterinary records. Dr. Vargas had driven out 10 days earlier and, in what she had described in her notes as one of the stranger professional experiences of her career, had examined Sovereign's hooves while Leona stood nearby, with the horse's attention moving between the vet's hands and Leona's face in a pattern the vet said she had never seen in a feral animal. The records showed a horse in poor hoof condition who had allowed medical examination without sedation. She submitted the photograph. Judge Oates studied it for a moment and asked Leona to describe what she was seeing in the image. Leona described the horse's posture, the proximity to the bucket, the condition of the grass indicating prolonged contact, a body at rest for several hours. She kept her voice level and her language plain. Roscoe's lawyer objected that a single photograph proved nothing about temperament or risk. Judge Oates said she was inclined to agree, and that a personal demonstration might be warranted, what nobody in that courtroom had anticipated, including Leona, who only found out when she asked, and the judge had said, "If you believe the animal's behavior can be documented in a controlled setting, I am prepared to adjourn to the property," was that 23 people would follow the 2 vehicles out to Leona's 12 acres on a cold November morning. Roscoe's lawyer tried to object to this on procedural grounds. Judge Oates looked at him briefly and said nothing, which was more effective than any response. They parked along the county road at the edge of Leona's property at 11:15. Sovereign was not visible. The land was flat enough that the entire parcel was visible from the road: scrub grass, the old barn, the fence line, the dark shape of the outbuilding. No horse. Roscoe stood with his arms crossed. His lawyer checked his phone twice. 2 of the ranchers who had signed the safety complaint talked to each other in low voices. Leona walked to the barn and returned with the bucket. She mixed the water the same way she always did. The salt, the dried chamomile, the unhurried movement of someone doing something they have done 1,000 times. She walked to the east fence line, set the bucket down at the gap, and stood back. Nobody spoke. A minute passed. 2. The wind moved across the grass in long, slow waves. Somewhere down the fence line, a magpie called once and went silent. Then he came from the south. He appeared at the edge of the outbuilding's shadow, walking with the particular economy of a large animal that is not in a hurry because it doesn't need to be. His size, in open daylight with 23 people watching, was genuinely startling. The scale of him registered differently than in photographs or drone footage. He walked toward the fence line without hesitation, not rushing, his attention moving in a wide arc that seemed to take in every person present before settling on Leona. He stopped at the bucket, drank. Then, as 23 people watched in complete silence, he lifted his head and walked 3 steps toward Leona, and she raised her right hand and laid it against the side of his face, and he stood there. He stood there for a long time. Roscoe's lawyers said, quietly, that this proved nothing about unpredictability. Judge Oates said, equally quietly, that she thought it proved rather a lot, and that she would be issuing her ruling before the end of the business day. The ruling arrived at 4:17. It affirmed Leona's estray claim. It dismissed the safety complaint as insufficiently documented. It included a single additional paragraph noting that the court found no factual basis for the characterization of the animal as aggressive, and that the documented evidence suggested an animal in recovery seeking stable conditions. Language that, in its specificity, strongly implied the court had considered who had written the safety complaint and why. Leona read it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she forgot to drink. She sat there for a while in the fading afternoon light, not celebrating, not crying, just sitting in the particular stillness of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see the shape of Sovereign standing near the barn in the last light. He was watching the house. November gave way to December without softness. The cold came in layers, first the hard frost, then the kind of sustained below-zero temperatures that test every system and structure on a working property. Leona moved through the days with the focused practicality of someone who has no margin for distraction. The water lines needed extra insulation. The hay supply required rationing to make it through to spring. Dulce's left hip was bothering her in the cold, and the extra attention she needed cut into the early mornings. Sovereign stayed. This was not guaranteed, and Leona never took it as such. Each morning she half expected the east fence line to be empty, the grass undisturbed, the horse gone back to his years of ranging. But each morning he was there, sometimes near the barn, sometimes at the southern edge of the property, sometimes standing motionless at the top of the low rise that gave a view of the surrounding valley in 3 directions. A horse doing what horses have always done, which is also watch for things. Dr. Vargas came twice more in November to continue treatment on the hoof injuries. The first visit, Sovereign let her work for 20 minutes before moving away. The second, he held position through the entire examination. The vet said very little during these visits beyond what was necessary, and on the second occasion, when she was packing her kit to leave, she paused and told Leona that in 18 years of large animal practice, she had seen nothing quite like this. Not the horse specifically, but the specific shape of whatever was happening between the horse and the property. The cooperative's canceled contract remained canceled. There was no dramatic reversal there, no sudden community repentance. 3 of the ranchers who had signed the safety complaint avoided Leona at the feed store with the focused deliberateness of people who know they've done something they'd prefer not to examine too closely. 2 others, separately, at different times, found small reasons to stop by the property over the following weeks. Once to return a fenced stretcher Arthur had lent out years ago, once without any stated reason at all, a brief visit that ended with Leona offering coffee and the man accepting it, and both of them looking out the kitchen window at the horse standing in the paddock. Roscoe did not return. He did not pursue further legal action, which his lawyer had told him was unlikely to succeed given the ruling's language. He did not withdraw the cooperative position, which would have created too visible a paper trail. He continued to run the Creston Ranch with the same methodical efficiency he had always brought to it. But there was a quality to his absence from the conversation about Sovereign that communicated something. The specific quality of a man who has taken a position publicly and been publicly wrong, and is managing the geometry of that fact. In late December, A woman who ran an equine rehabilitation nonprofit 3 counties over reached out to Leona after seeing the court filing in the public record. They spoke twice by phone. The nonprofit worked with ranches that were willing to host horses during recovery periods, providing veterinary support and modest stipends in exchange. The arrangement she described wasn't income in any substantial sense, but it would cover the veterinary costs and provide a framework for the relationship between Leona's property and Sovereign that had some institutional structure to it. Leona said she'd think about it and called back 2 days later. The tax obligation was still due in February. She sold the old hay baler she had been holding onto for no good reason except that Arthur had bought it, got 60% of what she'd hoped for, and paid the obligation with 2 weeks to spare. By the time the snow came in earnest, the late January storms that buried the lower valley in 2 feet of white and made the whole landscape look like a different planet, something had shifted in the daily life of the property that was difficult to describe precisely, but easy to observe. Sovereign had begun doing something that Leona noticed first, and then watched with careful attention to be sure she wasn't misinterpreting. When Dulce and Pepper were turned out in the small paddock each morning, he positioned himself at the paddock's perimeter, not aggressive, not possessive, just present. When something spooked the older horses, a low-flying plane, a coyote on the south fence line, a sudden gust rattling the barn door, they moved toward him rather than away. He absorbed the disturbance. He was, in whatever way a horse can be such a thing, an anchor. On the morning that 2 county inspectors arrived, a routine visit initiated, it later became clear, by a formal request from a neighboring property. Sovereign was standing at the entrance to the property when their truck came up the drive. Not blocking, not threatening, simply there, at full height, in full light, looking at the vehicle with the unhurried attention of something that had been in this landscape considerably longer than any bureaucratic process. The inspectors completed their visit efficiently and found nothing requiring follow-up. They said very little on the way out. One of them looked at the horse for a long moment before getting back in the truck. Dr. Vargas finished the hoof treatment series in January. She submitted her notes to the county brand board as part of the estray documentation process. In the section asking for behavioral observations, she wrote, "Animal demonstrates no aggressive tendencies. Responds to familiar handler with consistent calm. Prognosis for full hoof recovery is good with continued appropriate conditions." She read back over this language after writing it and considered whether it captured what she had actually witnessed over those 4 visits. It was accurate. It was also, she felt, insufficient. What she had watched was a 17-hand horse that had spent years being pursued across 3 counties lying down in the snow and letting a 62-year-old woman clean and wrap his hooves with the patience of something that has finally found the place it was looking for. She didn't know how to put that in a county form. She left the notes as they were. Spring came the way it always does in that valley, not all at once, but in increments, small shifts in light and temperature that accumulate until one morning the frost is gone and the creek is running and the grass is that specific yellow-green of new growth. Sovereign's coat deepened as the season turned, the gold of him more saturated in the longer light. The equine rehabilitation arrangement with the nonprofit went through in March. It brought a modest but steady income, a relationship with a wider community of people interested in horse welfare, and 2 occasional volunteers who came out on weekends to help with general maintenance. One of them was a young woman studying large animal behavior at the university in Laramie who, on her first visit, stood at the paddock fence for 45 minutes just watching Sovereign move and taking notes with an expression Leona recognized as the one her own face made when she was trying to memorize something she was afraid she'd forget. The relationship with the cooperative remained broken through that first spring. By summer, 2 of the smaller ranches in the valley had begun buying hay directly from Leona at fair market price, routing around the cooperative entirely. This was not a dramatic shift, but it was a direction. What Roscoe Callahan had perhaps miscalculated, and what he likely never admitted to himself, because the accounting of errors in proud men runs slow, was the distinction between a community that follows and a community that watches. For years, the ranchers of the valley had followed his lead on questions of land, livestock, and shared resources because his judgment was generally sound and his resources were decisive. But they had also been watching. And what they had watched, in that November hearing and in the months that followed, was a 62-year-old woman on 12 acres hold a position that required no reinforcement accept the position itself, and be right. Communities remember that, not always in words, often just in the slow recalibration of who they look toward when something difficult comes up. Leona put Arthur's grocery list back on the refrigerator. She had taken it down during one of the bleaker weeks in November, folded it, put it in a drawer. In March, she found it again and put it back. Milk, 2 cans of pinto beans. WD-40. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she made coffee and went to start the morning feeding. Here is what this story is not about. It is not about a magical horse choosing the right person in some destined, cinematic way. It is not about a poor widow defeating a rich villain through the power of goodness. It is not about the wild world recognizing virtue and rewarding it. Sovereign was exhausted. He had been run for years by people with resources, technology, and a very clear idea of what he was worth to them. He found a fence line that had food and water and no pursuit, and he lay down. That's an animal making a rational decision under conditions of severe stress. What Leona brought to that situation was not magic. It was patience, consistency, and the complete absence of demand. She put the bucket out every night because Arthur had always put the bucket out. She stayed still when staying still was needed. She made no plans for the horse and asked nothing from him, which meant he had nothing to flee from. And when the pressure came, when the financial structure of her life was quietly being dismantled one contract at a time, she made a choice. Not a comfortable one, not a financially rational one. A choice that came from somewhere below the level of calculation, from that place in a person where the things they actually believe about themselves live. The cost was real. The winter was hard. The cooperative contract didn't come back on its own. But the horse stayed. And something about 12 acres with a water bucket and a woman who asked nothing from the world except to be left to do things the right way. Something about that became, over a season, a thing the valley couldn't quite look away from. Whatever name you want to give that, integrity, stubbornness, grace, it held. That's the story. If something in it stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. This community keeps growing because of you, and every story we tell is made better by knowing you're there. Until next time.